We are pleased to welcome to TVO tonight Mr. Justice Murray Sinclair. He is the chair of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it's very nice to have you in that chair and to meet you.
Thank you very much.
I want to start because we're going to have a wide-ranging discussion here over the next 20 minutes or so on a range of issues related to your commission. But I want to start by playing a piece of tape that was no doubt one of the most significant moments in the history of this country. Here's the Prime Minister of the country almost 2 years ago in the House of Commons. Roll tape, please, Michael.
Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. We now recognize that it was wrong to separate children from rich and vibrant cultures and traditions, that it created a void in many lives and communities, and we apologize for having done this.
In the almost 2 years since that apology was made, what do you think Aboriginal people have taken from that?
Well, I think the apology itself was a momentous moment in the lives of the survivors, particularly. I think the Aboriginal communities generally, and for Canadians as well. It was a recognition of the wrongs of the past, the fact that what was done and what was intended to be done was unacceptable. So I think it was very important. I know that there were many survivors in particular, survivors of those who went to the residential schools and had been there as students. I know that many of them were very impacted by the hearing of the apology, because for them it was finally a recognition that what they had been saying all along was right, and it was finally a sense of validation about it. But at the same time, for many of them, it was just the beginning. It was the beginning of a process in which they now are trying to come to terms with the fact that the anger about the secrecy of it is behind them.
Well, enter Judge Sinclair. You're part of that process, and I think most people are certainly aware of and remember this apology. It got a great deal of coverage. Something that got a lot less coverage is the work that you're doing. You're the chair of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What's your mandate?
Well, our mandate is in the name, Truth and Reconciliation, and there are components to that that we all have to try to bring forward to the public. The truth component is for us to essentially discover what really went on in the residential schools. And to do that, we document the experiences and the stories of the survivors. We collect all of the materials, written and otherwise, that are available about that experience. We are entitled to receive copies of all of the documents in the possession of the churches who ran the schools and the government who funded them, to take a look at what was going on internally within their communications, and then at the same time to do research, to fill in the gaps of our knowledge. And once we've done that, then we're obligated to file a report.
How much time you got for all that?
Well, the mandate of the Commission was 5 years. We have been given appointments until 2014 to get that done. In addition to that, we have a process of reconciliation that we also have to engage in, and that process involves informing the public about this, educating the public about residential schools, and asking the public to accept that there are still more things that need to be done.
The process you're undergoing, I suspect the best example people remember is the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So could you compare what you're doing to what they did?
South Africa's commission was a very different kind of commission. They had different powers and different obligations that they were trying to achieve. Ours was similar in some respects. Certainly the fact that we're in search of the truth and we're in search of a way to bring people together is one thing. But we need to remember that there was a majority of people who were under the control of a minority of people in a South African situation. Here it was a very distinct minority that was under the control of a majority of the population and majority government representing that population. And so that's a distinct difference. The amount of violence in South Africa that accompanied the apartheid regime, of course, was well known, and that was part of what they were trying to get at. And the opportunity to bring together the perpetrator and the victim of those acts of violence in South Africa was more possible than it is in our situation, because a lot of the acts of violence that occurred in the residential schools, the acts of physical abuse and sexual abuse, are historical.
Are dead, I guess.
Are historical.
Yeah.
Many of the perpetrators are either too old to be held to account, according to the government's prosecutors who looked at the files, or they've deceased and are no longer available. And some of the survivors, of course, have passed on too.
Part of your work, I gather, involves mounting national, for lack of a better expression, well, what do we want to call them? Get-togethers.
National events.
National events, okay, we'll just call them that. And I want to show another piece of tape here from one that you did in your hometown of Winnipeg. I guess this was last year, almost a year ago.
Our first national event.
And this is the then Indian Affairs Minister, Chuck Strahl, listening to the story of one of the survivors. And it's, I suspect people have not seen this tape before, so I'm really glad they're going to get to see it right now. Michael, if you would, roll tape.
I'd like to thank you for taking time to listen, and I don't want to apologize for being emotional, because we've been at this for 30 years. We've been asking to be heard for 30 years. We now have a voice. We can start breathing again. We can start living again.
To make sure that we do everything we can to make sure that the record is complete, that we turn over every rock, that we make every supreme effort to make sure that we get that kind of information and that we work together so that we can, that you can get some peace.
Her hand on his back is just unbelievable. Wasn't that amazing? Talk to us about the importance of moments like that.
Well, Minister Strahl, of course, was a leader in our community, and at that time was the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs. And his presence in the circle with the survivors who were speaking was an important gesture on his part, and an important act. But in addition to that, I think this emphasizes what we've been saying all along, and that is that nobody who listens to the stories of the survivors cannot be impacted by it. You listen to what they say, not just the acts that they suffered, but the impact of the school in their lives, the fact that they were taken away as children, that they were placed in institutions. They were not allowed to see their parents. They were not allowed to see their brothers and sisters. They couldn't speak their language. They couldn't practice their culture.
And then disbelieved for years.
And then disbelieved for years. And all of that speaks to the fact that now they are being given the opportunity finally to talk about this in an open way, in a way that, that validates them, because now they're talking to each other as well as to the public. And so it's going to be a long process of healing. And circles like that, that we've participated in with survivors across the country and in the North, have been an amazing experience for us as commissioners to listen to that. But at the same time, you can see the impact that they're having on the survivors. But what we really need to do is we need to ensure that Canadians hear those stories too, because we want Canadians to understand that this is not just an Aboriginal problem. This is a Canadian issue that needs to be addressed. The relationship between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people in this country has been damaged by these schools. And part of that damage is not merely what happened to the students in the schools. That damage is also what happened to Canadians who went to their own schools and who were taught what they were taught, or not taught what they should have been taught about Aboriginal people in this country.
Okay, let's talk. I want to do a little history here, a little recent history. Not unlike many new ventures in the history of this country, your commission got off to a bit of a rocky start. And here's the quote that you gave in September of 2010 before the Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples. You said, "Let's acknowledge that the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has had its share of startup challenges. Any organization for which there is no precedent, entrusted with a mandate the scope of the TRCs, is going to need time to find its way. This is undeniable and not the least unexpected." You became the chair, I gather, in July after the first chair, Justice Harry Laforme, and the two commissioners resigned. What happened there?
I don't know what happened there. I haven't spoken with the previous commissioners about the details of what was going on between them, and quite frankly, it wasn't of interest to me. Other
Did it
than
hamstring your ability to do your work?
Well, what it did was it caused me as a commission chair to understand the importance of ensuring that as commissioners we got off on the right footing. And so what we did as commissioners was we had our own retreat right at the beginning. The day that our appointments were announced, we got together for 3 days and we talked about why we were there, what we wanted to achieve, and how we were going to do it.
So it's you chairing how many people now on the commission?
We have 3 people on the commission in total, including me.
3 people in total. And you're content that you're now on the right foot and able to do your work?
Absolutely. I think as a commission, we're now in a very solid position. Part of the startup challenge that we face is, as with any federal or any government-created body, is to simply get the organization up and running. And that has taken us a while as well. But we're now in a position where we feel that we're able to go about completing our mandate.
Okay, beyond the retreat, what have you done to make sure that this organization is on a more solid footing and can do its work?
We have recognized that one of the important things that we're doing, of course, is speaking with survivors and including them in our decision-making is very important. We have a Survivors Advisory Committee that we consult regularly. We meet regularly with the parties to ensure that we include them in the work that we're doing and that they understand what we're about. In addition to that, we also give them homework because we tell them, the parties, the government, the churches, the survivors, we tell them that reconciliation is not going to be something that we're going to do as a commission. It's going to be something that they have to do. And as parties to the agreement, they have to decide what reconciliation means to them and how it's going to come about. And in turn, they have to help the public come along in that conversation as well.
Let me ask you to help us understand what the Missing Children Research Project, which is also part of your commission's work, what's that all about?
One of the early discoveries from the research that was done at the startup of the commission was a recognition that there were a number of children who were sent to residential schools who never came home. They died at the schools, they died perhaps from neglect, perhaps from abuse, perhaps when they ran away, but they never came back home. And the survivors who did make it back home and their families have told us of the numbers, and we're first of all trying to get a handle on what those numbers are. So that's one of our research initiatives at this point in time. We do know that it runs into the thousands. It's much larger than I thought it was when I first took on this position. Then the second question we have to ask ourselves is what happened to them? How did they die? Do we know that? And if we were able to determine that, then that may bring some peace to the families and the communities that they came from. And then the final issue is where are they? Where are they buried? And what do the families know about where they're buried? And once they discover where they're buried, then are they able to make a decision as to what they want to do with that?
Judge Sinclair, I'm now going to read, so get comfortable, a little story here that was in the Toronto Star. This is about one family, and then I'll come out of this with a question. Michael, if you would, let's bring this up. Charlie Hunter drowned at age 13 in a lake near the residential school on October 22nd, 1974. He snuck off in the afternoon to skate with 2 other students on October 22nd, 74. A partially blind boy named Joseph Kustachin fell through the ice. Charlie and his friends struggled to save him. A tersely worded Ontario Provincial Police report notes, Hunter, in attempting to rescue Kustachin, also fell through ice. The partially blind boy was saved, Charlie was not. It was hours before his lifeless body was pulled to land. He was buried under a white wooden cross in Moosonee. His parents say they weren't consulted about funeral arrangements. Now the family is petitioning the federal government to pay for his reburial in Pewanuk, population 250, near Hudson Bay. Charlie Hunter's family made a statement to the commission late last year, and I wonder what's happened with his case since that article was written a few months back.
When they came to see us, one of the pieces of information that's not in that story that's important to understand is that he didn't drown at a residential school in Moosonee. He drowned at a residential school in southern Canada. The government authorities then moved his body partway home to the community of Moosonee. His community is actually on the other side of the Hudson's Bay. And for some reason, they didn't move his body all the way back to his home community. Instead, they brought the family from his community into Moosonee and they buried his body there, and much to his parents' dismay. And his parents, and we have to remember this is in '74, so this is relatively recent, his parents were always desirous of him coming back home, wanting him to go back home. So as a result of the communication with the commission and as a result of the public information that came out about that story, the Toronto Star engaged in a public campaign to raise money for the family to help them to move his body from where it's buried to his home community. And they've succeeded in raising enough money now to move it. But that doesn't relieve the government of the obligation that I think they had to begin with, to understand that they're the ones who made the error. They're the ones who did what they did, and they shouldn't have buried him where they buried him. And they should have accepted responsibility to have moved his body when the request was first made. And the request was made, and the request was denied.
Okay, a few minutes left here, and I want to touch on two more things. Understandably, there may be some in the Aboriginal community who don't want to come forward and tell their story before the Commission for a whole bunch of perfectly legitimate and understandable reasons. What would you say to them?
One of the things that we've always said to survivors is that we understand if there's too much pain there for you to talk to us, and we accept that, and we're not forcibly telling people that they have an obligation to talk to us. But we do remind survivors that in the end result, after this is all over, and when they're no longer with us, that their family's going to always wonder what happened, what went on in those schools, what happened to my grandmother, my grandfather, or my auntie, my uncle. And if they ever want their family to find some peace and to understand, then they should help them. And we've encouraged survivors to come forward, and we've said to them, if you want us to hold your story from public knowledge or even from your family's access to it until you're gone, we will respect that. We will protect that story as much as possible, but we want them to understand that the telling of the story will be very good for them, and in the long run it'll be very good for their family and for their community, and we hope that they can understand that.
And you started this conversation by saying, yes, this is something that Aboriginal communities across Canada will be understandably extremely interested in, but it's also important for non-Aboriginal communities to be connected to this as well. Because why?
Absolutely. The one thing we remind members of the public about is while they were teaching Aboriginal students in these schools that their cultures were inferior, their languages were inferior, and their historical existence was irrelevant, they were teaching the very same thing to non-Aboriginal children in a public school system. And so Canada has raised population upon population of people. Generations now of people have been raised with this particular attitude and information about Aboriginal people, which is just wrong. And what we need to understand is it's this education system that got us into this situation where this relationship is so bad. And it's going to be the educational system that's going to get us out of it. We're going to have to look at ways of ensuring that children who are educated in the future, Aboriginal children and non-Aboriginal children, are educated fully, properly, and adequately about the residential schools and their impact on our society.
I must say, I still cannot get over that picture of Chuck Strahl on behalf of the Government of Canada, who saw his job as going there to comfort her. And in the end, it was she who put her hand on his back and comforted him. I mean, if that's not a wonderful metaphor for the connection we need between our two peoples, I don't know what is.
The survivors know and knew then that Chuck Strahl was a wonderful human being. And they understood how important it was for that gesture that he made in being there to come to them. And they understood how difficult it must have been for him to be representing the government who had done all of this because of his own humanity.
Judge Sinclair, we wish you well with your work, and we thank you for coming into TVO tonight to tell us all about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.